here at IEM Digital Summit, Duncan Wood. Welcome.
Many thanks. Muchísimas gracias por esa presentación tan linda. Y déjame decir que este evento es tan importante que voy a faltar, no voy a poder ver un partido de Liverpool. Están jugando a la 1 del día, hora Chihuahua, en el Premier League, pero esto es mucho más importante. Aunque un entrenador de Liverpool dijo que el fútbol no es cuestión de la vida o la muerte, es algo mucho más importante. Pero muchísimas gracias por invitarme a este evento. Sí voy a dar la presentación en inglés, pero déjame decir algunas palabras en español primero, porque quiero expresar mi amor para el estado de Chihuahua y para la ciudad de Chihuahua. He visitado muchas veces en mi vida. Soy gran fan, obviamente, de la gastronomía, de la región, de la machaca, la carne asada, el queso menonita, obviamente los burritos originarios de allá, y el sotol, por supuesto. Y una persona muy importante para mí, quien por la primera vez me invitó a tomar sotol con él, fue el gran Federico Terrazas, que ya no está con nosotros, pero le extraño mucho. Él fue un premiado del Wilson Center en 2013 y nos volvimos amigos después de eso. Fue un miembro de mi consejo en el Wilson Center también. También quiero mandar saludos a la presidenta municipal, María Eugenia Campos. Nos visitó en el Wilson Center recientemente, hace un año, y fue un gran placer poder tenerla allá con nosotros. Extraño a la calidad de los chihuahuenses, la verdad, y sobre todo en un día como hoy en Washington. Hace mucho frío y de verdad está nevando. Entonces, muchísimas gracias por invitarme a este foro. Voy a entrar ahorita en mi presentación. Voy a hablar más o menos 30, 40 minutos y después tendremos un espacio para preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, I'm going to switch to English right now. So if you need to have translation, get them on it right now. Here we go. Okay. Okay. I hope that everybody can see this. My presentation today is to talk about bilateral relations, and through the lens of bilateral relations to talk about the AMLO administration in Mexico, the Cuarta Transformación, the fourth transformation of Mexico, and what I see as the storm that is coming in that bilateral relationship because of what's happening in Mexico and what's happening here in the United States. Well, let's just take a moment to look at where we are with the fourth transformation after 2 years in Mexico. The first question is, what is the fourth transformation? And as somebody who has studied Mexico for 25 years or more, I've agonized over what is meant by the fourth transformation. We have the definitions that Andrés Manuel López Obrador puts out in his morning press conferences, his famous mañaneras. I see it as, yes, it is a virtual revolution for Mexico. It's supposed to be a reform of public life. It's a return to a supposedly mythical golden age of Mexico when things were much better. But perhaps it's best to make a historical comparison. It's the fourth transformation because, number one, we had the first transformation, which was independence. Number two, we had the transformation of the reform period in the late 19th century in Mexico. Thirdly, we had the transformation of the revolution in the early 20th century. And AMLO believes that this is his opportunity to leave his legacy, his political legacy for Mexico, to transform the country. But overall, I would say that the main idea, the main goal of this project is essentially the re-centralization of power in the hands of the federal government to the detriment of the states, to the detriment of municipalities, to the detriment of the private sector, and to the detriment of civil society. It is the centralization of power not just in the federal government, but in the office of the presidency itself. Because AMLO believes that that is the way to overcome the many problems that he sees in Mexico that have torn it apart. If you looked at the language that he used in his 2018 election campaign, he talked at length about the fact that Mexico was broken, that Mexico was torn apart by corruption, obviously the violence that continues to plague the country. And he believes that the answer to all of that is centralization. We see this in the way that he handles the federal government itself, his relationship with the Congress, his attempted relationship with state governors, etc., etc. The way that he uses his communication strategy, in particular the mañaneras, but not just the mañaneras, to attack his opponents relentlessly. The fact is that he has managed to intimidate people across the political spectrum in Mexico, from private business through civil society, other political parties, because of the threat of using Hacienda to investigate and the SAT to investigate their affairs. Part of this is, of course, his equation of corruption with neoliberalism. In other words, the system that has been in place since the early 1990s in Mexico is, in his opinion, fundamentally corrupt. And anybody who has benefited from that, in his opinion, is also corrupt. I also suspect that in his mind, there is a connection between money and evil. In other words, we have this expression in English, it's pretty much the same in Spanish. Money is the root of all evil. And I believe that Andrés Manuel López Obrador subscribes to that belief. Now, I've given this explanation of what I see as the fourth transformation many times in many places. And, you know, generally people say, well, some interesting points you make there. But a consul of Mexico came up to me once in Laredo, Texas, and said to me, I find that very interesting, Duncan, but there's a much simpler definition of what the fourth transformation and what it is. He said, the fourth transformation is essentially the separation of economic from political power. Andrés Manuel believes that the economic elites have controlled Mexico for too long. And now it's time to reassert the primacy of political power over economic power. And it's the most brilliant and most simple explanation of the fourth transformation that anyone's ever given me. It's much better than my own explanation of it. For the simple reason that that is exactly how AMLO thinks as a leader. He believes that economic logic should be subservient to political logic. He believes that the economy matters only in as much as it impacts upon his capacity to centralize political power in the country. That's why he talks about the mafia del poder, the power mafia in Mexico. That's why he has attacked relentlessly the economic interests of the Monterrey industrialists and, of course, industrialists in Chihuahua as well. This is something that he believes is part of his mission in Mexico. And once again, let me remind you that his image, his vision for Mexico is of a simpler Mexico, one that, you know, we became familiar with back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It was where the federal government played a much more important role, when there was one hegemonic party, and when the economy was governed through corporatism, and when the private sector, civil society, the unions were all subservient to the government. So how has he been doing after 2 years? Well, you there in Chihuahua know much better than me about the economy. It hasn't been a good story. And even prior to the COVID pandemic, we know that Andrés Manuel López Obrador's economic policies had plunged Mexico into recession. We were looking at 15 months of recession prior to COVID. And of course, that's just got much worse. His decisions over the Mexico City airport, his decisions over other investment projects, his decisions over the Constellation Brands refinery up in Mexicali, the fact that he refuses to use the fiscal power of the state to invest in the productive economy. All of these have been disastrous decisions, in my opinion, for the Mexican economy. And although everybody in the world is suffering right now because of COVID, the Mexican recession, I believe, will last a lot longer than it should do, simply because of those wrong-headed decisions being made in Presidencia for the last 2 years. We see this most clearly in the energy sector, where, of course, there has been an obsession with cutting back on private investment and foreign investment in the oil and gas sectors and in electricity. We see his obsession with building a refinery, one that is not cost effective, one that Mexico really doesn't need. And in my opinion, a complete waste of somewhere between 12 and 18 billion dollars, entre 12 y 18 mil millones de dólares. We don't know how much because, of course, there will be no transparency in that project. And to me, this is one of the greatest tragedies of the AMLO administration so far, which is that after the energy reform of 2013, we know that the problems of corruption were far from solved in the energy sector. Just look at the scandals that have emerged from Pemex. But in the bidding rounds for oil and gas blocks in the Gulf of Mexico, there was an extraordinary level of transparency there. We know exactly how much everybody bid. We know how the decisions were made. And that was a huge step forward, in my opinion. And we've lost all of that. On public security and the fight against organized crime, well, the thing is that it's 2 years into administration. We still really don't have a well-defined public security strategy in Mexico. The former head of public security, Alfonso Durazo, of course, has stepped down, and he's been replaced by somebody who has very little experience in this area. Certainly, we do not have a credible public security strategy in Mexico. And now, of course, we're hearing all of the declarations from Mexico, from the federal government and from the Congress about reducing cooperation with the United States, something that I'll come back to later on. On the fight against corruption, I mentioned the energy sector earlier on. The highest profile arrest in this struggle against corruption has, of course, been Emilio Lozoya, but also we could mention Rosario Robles, and there have been others. But I have to say that, speaking as somebody with a fair amount of experience in the fight against corruption through my work with the World Economic Forum, what I see in Mexico is the weaponization of the anti-corruption struggle. The fact is that AMLO is using the fight against corruption as a way to intimidate his political and economic opponents. Look, for example, at the way he has treated the corruption charges that have come against various people in his administration. John Ackerman, for example, and his wife, the head of Función Pública. Manuel Bartlett, the head of the CFE, and of course, famously, his own brother, Pio. Whenever there are charges or accusations made against his own people, he ignores them. He doesn't give them any credibility at all. When it's with an opponent, well, then it becomes serious. But think about how he is handling the prosecution of people like Emilio Lozoya. He has brought them home to Mexico so that he can use them as political tools to either get them to sing, in other words, to share information on how corrupt other people, other political opponents have been, or he uses them as a way to keep quiet about corruption that has taken place with people close to him. Sadly, because I really did hope that AMLO was going to be serious about corruption, sadly, we cannot take this seriously after 2 years. And lastly, of course, on public health, we have to say that the public health strategy that Andrés Manuel López Obrador has put in place has been disastrous. We can focus, of course, on the more than 100,000 dead, and those are the official numbers, double it or triple it if you like to get the real numbers, the dead from COVID. But even before that, the healthcare sector was being managed in a disastrous fashion. COFEPRIS, the healthcare sector regulator, was being used as a way to fight private and foreign interests in the healthcare system, to exert political power to the detriment of the Mexican people. And let me just give you one key example, which I think shows how wrong-headed, how mistaken this strategy is on public health. Recently, the Mexican Congress passed new packaging laws for medication in Mexico, which said that if medication was going to be sold to the public healthcare, public hospitals, then it need to be put into completely different packaging from that was sold to the private sector. And the packaging was not just the box in which the medicine came, but actually the little blister pack where the pills are. That had to say on it that it was for the public health sector. Now, when you speak to folks in the industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, they say, well, for things like aspirin, that's fine because, so many of those pills will be used every year that it makes sense for us to create a separate production line. And we can do that. But there are many medicines that we sell in Mexico, but we sell very few of them. We are not going to set up an entirely different production line just to have different packaging for Mexico's public hospitals. So what is the unintended consequence of this packaging law, which was designed to fight corruption and theft? In other words, it may have had the best kind of intentions. The unintended consequence is that, in fact, Mexicans are going to go without vital medicine because it simply won't be available. So overall, my evaluation of AMLO after 2 years is it's been disastrous. But then we go to the right-hand side of your screen and we see how incredibly popular AMLO continues to be. And these are the Mitofsky numbers, which are not as enthusiastic as polls that are seen, for example, in El Financiero, where you would add maybe as much as 7 or 8 points to these numbers. Sure, in the middle of this year, AMLO had some difficult times when his approval rating dipped into negative territory. You see there in April, in June, AMLO wasn't doing so well. But there has been a remarkable recovery since July, when we see how popular Andrés Manuel continues to be. And it's not that these are historically groundbreaking numbers. We know that, for example, Felipe Calderón maintained an approval rating of around 60-65% until the end of his administration. But given the disastrous circumstances in which Mexico finds itself, this is truly remarkable. And the only explanation that I have for this is that AMLO is a damn good communicator. Maybe not to you and me. Maybe not to those of us who watch the Mañanera and say, well, this is garbage. This is complete manipulation of the truth. But to a lot of people in Mexico, and clearly a majority of the voters in Mexico, Andrés Manuel's message, and most importantly, his communication style, has been very successful and continues to be successful. He speaks the language of the average man and woman in the street. He tells anecdotes. He tells stories. He uses colloquialisms, me canso ganso being the most famous of them. This is a man who knows how to connect with people. And if you want to understand it better, all you have to do is just watch a YouTube video of an AMLO rally in 2018. See how voters interacted with him. See how much they believe in him. The idea of the tropical messiah is still very much alive today. What about the bilateral relationship? Well, here in 4 different blocks, we can see that there has been a dramatic transformation of that relationship. If we go back to the NAFTA years, when, post 1994, right up until 2016, we seem to be on an unavoidable path towards deeper, closer integration between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, but in particular between the United States and Mexico. Most of you on this conference, this event today, will have personal experience of that, of the markets that have become available in the United States and the constant back and forth across the US-Mexico border that characterized the period from 1994 up until 2016. It wasn't just economic. We saw a deeper integration on public security through the Merida Initiative, which was signed in 2007. And of course, we saw deeper integration of the societies, with more and more Mexicans living in the United States and more Mexican Americans, American citizens of Mexican origin who were voting in US elections. But then in 2016, we get the arrival of Trump, the great disruptor, and he threw aside all of the established wisdom on the bilateral relationship and adopted a much more aggressive tone. We remember very well his accusations that Mexican immigrants were rapists and murderers. We see all of the constant insults that he has hurled south of the border. And of course, his obsession with building a border wall. And when AMLO came into office in 2018, despite the fact that during the election campaign that year, AMLO had said that he was the man that would stand up to Trump, in fact, he did exactly the opposite. He rolled over and offered his belly to be scratched. Why? Because he understood, and AMLO understands these things in a guttural basis deep within him, that Trump is more powerful than he is, and that Trump had the power to damage AMLO's political project. And so AMLO took the very, very smart decision. When I say smart, I mean politically smart decision to say, give Trump everything that he wants and he'll leave us alone. And that's exactly what we've seen. Whether it was on final adjustments to the USMCA agreement or whether it was on migration, AMLO has let Trump do whatever he wants. And in exchange, Trump has kept quiet about AMLO's political project, about the terrible abuses of power that are taking place in Mexico, about human rights abuses, about the attacks on foreign and domestic investors in Mexico. And that implicit bargain, the great bargain between a great disruptor and AMLO, is where we find ourselves today. But the question is, what awaits with Biden? Well, many people would say Biden is a very different politician than Donald Trump. So we might expect a return to the status quo ex ante. Basically an image or a vision of the bilateral relationship that we saw during the NAFTA years. And I think that would be wonderful if we were going to get that. But I'm not so sure that is what we're going to see. So let's turn to what I see coming in the next 4 years. Biden is now president-elect. AMLO has now congratulated him. The letter that was sent yesterday was not the most forthcoming of letters. It wasn't a letter that got people particularly excited. And it sent a very, very clear message, in my opinion. And that message was that, congratulations on winning the election, but essentially we are not interested in working closely with you. So what are we going to see in the next 4 years? Because we know how AMLO operates. AMLO is not an institution builder. He is a charismatic politician that operates through personal relationships. What is Joe Biden? Joe Biden's charismatic. If you ever get the chance to sit down and have lunch with him, he's terrific. He's a great raconteur. He will tell you a great story. He grabs you by the arm and makes you feel incredibly important. He has built relationships through his entire political career, but that's not who he is as a politician. Joe Biden is an institutionalist. Joe Biden believes that operating through the established government and diplomatic channels is the way to go. He believes in the rules of the game. And he believes that Mexico and the United States have a bright future together. But in order to get to that bright future, I think that Biden and his team are going to learn a great deal from observing what happened during the Trump years. What Trump exposed in the bilateral relationship from 2016 to today is the immense power disparities that exist between Mexico and the United States. We all know that the United States is more powerful than Mexico, but for the last 30 years, most politicians have operated as though Mexico and the United States were equals. And when push came to shove, of course, the United States' disproportionate power came to bear. But it was never used in a bullying fashion. Trump showed how to do that, and he showed how effective it could be. The Biden people will recognize that. The Biden people will learn that, in fact, even though AMLO doesn't want to cooperate, they will have several levers of power that they can use to get him to collaborate. On trade and investment, there is deep concern within the Biden team about the ways in which U.S. companies are being treated in Mexico. The pharmaceutical sector I've already mentioned, the energy sector I've already mentioned, and of course, I've mentioned the famous case of the Constellation Brands brewery up in Mexicali. But when I speak to my friends who work in the Commerce Department here in Washington on the desk that deals with Mexico, they say to me, what is going on in Mexico? Their desks have never been more full of complaints against Mexico than they are today. And all of these complaints are piling up on their desks. Trump has not been willing to do anything about them for one very good reason. Trump doesn't want American firms investing in Mexico. He wants them to invest in the United States. Biden, however, will see things differently. He will seek to defend the interests of U.S. firms in Mexico. So we can expect him to use not just the power of his office as president, not just the office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, but of course the legal framework of the USMCA, which was negotiated by Trump. I expect that in 2021, we will see a series of complaints, demandas against Mexico by the Biden administration. And that is going to put a lot of pressure on Andrés Manuel López Obrador because the rules are not in his favor in this. Whether it is on the regulation of the energy sector, labeling requirements in pharmaceuticals, we will see that U.S. firms have completely legitimate complaints against the Mexican government. And because those investor state protections are still there in USMCA, they are weaker than they were in the NAFTA, but they're still there. We will see a lot of pressure on Mexico. And that's something that I don't think AMLO has really understood. On questions of energy and climate, we know that Biden comes in and his administration is going to be obsessed with climate change, renewable energy, cutting back on fossil fuels. Look at his choice for energy secretary, which was announced yesterday. This is somebody who has a long experience with electric vehicles. We're going to see pressure from the Biden people on Mexico to change the way in which the energy sector is managed in Mexico and to get Mexico back to where it used to be under Calderón and Peña Nieto, which was a leader amongst emerging markets, developing countries on the issue of climate change mitigation. Biden will rejoin the Paris Accord and will seek Mexican support for that. But perhaps most challenging in the long term is that we can expect that there will be a conversation or many conversations here in Washington over a carbon tax at the US border. In other words, if products are not being manufactured in a way that reduces emissions, then we can expect that they will have to pay a surcharge or a duty when they cross over the border into the United States. And unless AMLO turns things around for Mexico, this could be economically disastrous for the country. On public security, we've seen the cases recently of the Cienfuegos arrest, which shocked everybody, and then his return to Mexico, which shocked people even more. We don't know why Cienfuegos has returned. It's a combination of AMLO wanting to placate the Mexican military. We know that. It's a combination of AMLO having done favors for the Trump administration. His visit to the White House in July of this year, for example, his refusal to congratulate Biden. Was it payback for that? But I think it's also because there was a threat on the part of AMLO that DEA agents in Mexico would have their immunity taken away. So the United States, or rather the Trump administration and Attorney General Barr, returned Cienfuegos to Mexico, and then what happened? Well, yesterday legislation passed the Mexican Congress, which will take away that diplomatic immunity for DEA agents anyway, unless they share all their information with their Mexican counterparts. In other words, there was a deal that was made. The United States returns Cienfuegos, and DEA agents get to operate as they have been in Mexico. And then Mexico changes that deal ex post facto. There is a sense here in Washington, and I was on a call yesterday about this. There is a sense here in Washington that Mexico screwed the United States. And a lot of people here are very unhappy about it. This is not a good sign. AMLO's obsessive use of or referencing of sovereignty and the fact that Mexico has the right to self-determination. Of course, Mexico has the right to self-determination. But does Mexico have the tools to stop organized crime groups? No, it clearly doesn't. And people say, well, the United States and Mexico have been working together for 13 years on this, and things are worse than ever. That's not wrong. What I will say, however, is that if you run the counterfactual, things would be much worse. Really, United States intelligence cooperation with Mexico is fundamentally important in keeping organized crime at the level that it is right now. Without that, I fear we're going to see things getting worse. Lastly, migration and the border. Two issues here. One, many people suspect that Biden will not continue with the Trump policy on migration. Certainly, we will see changes. It'll be a more humane approach to migration. But the Biden administration desperately, desperately needs Mexican cooperation in controlling the flow of Central American migrants coming northwards. And so without that ongoing cooperation from AMLO and his people, the United States will face a real crisis at the southwest border. And I speak to you knowing what that means for your communities, particularly folks up in Ciudad Juarez who are going to see this surge, but of course across the US-Mexico border. And AMLO, I believe, AMLO has an idea that this is the one important bargaining chip that he has to play, which is if I don't continue to help the United States on migration, then the United States will pay a huge cost. In other words, as long as I continue to help on migration, the United States has to leave me alone. That was the logic with Trump. It's not going to work the same way with Biden. We're not going to see the same kind of issue linkage. We're going to see a multi-dimensional approach. And that's going to be a lot more complicated for AMLO to deal with as he tries to navigate the relationship. So a couple of words here. Sorry, I've gone too fast. I forgot to talk about the border itself. I talked about migration. But the border itself is, has been such a controversial issue during the Trump years. We've seen the very aggressive construction of a border wall and border barrier, which continues apace right now. Really shocking video footage of work going on 24 hours a day so that as much of the border wall can be completed as possible before Trump leaves office. We're not going to see that same approach with Biden. But we won't see a relaxing of border controls, particularly the border controls that were imposed to deal with the threat of COVID. I think we're still several months away from that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, about what the future holds for the border itself. But I think that we need to restrain our optimism in this regard, because it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward. I think that there are many, many difficult days ahead. I want to talk a little bit about the China challenge and nearshoring, because one thing which has become very apparent during the last 4 years, and in particular the last 2 years, is how a trade war between the United States and China has opened up all kinds of possibilities for the reshoring of investment and the nearshoring of investment. And with the negotiation of USMCA to replace the NAFTA, both Mexico and Canada are perfectly placed to benefit from US investors and the investors of other countries leaving China and looking for countries that have a free trade agreement with the United States, i.e. Mexico and Canada, or going and investing directly in the United States. You know, the Republicans here in Washington like to accuse Biden of being too friendly to the Chinese. It's complete garbage, that argument. Biden is going to continue to face off with the Chinese in a different fashion, with a different tone. But we are deeply embedded now in a great power competition between China and the United States. That means that the opportunities for a country like Mexico, which has relatively low labor costs, which has a well-developed, although imperfect, infrastructure, which has human capital in abundance, which has a young demographic profile, and of course, which has a free trade agreement and shares a 2,000-mile border with the United States, Mexico is in the best place possible. And I'm reminded of a story from the 1980s. A Canadian diplomat was at an international meeting with some Japanese diplomats, and he was complaining about how difficult it is to deal with the United States. He said, you know, when you share a 2,000-mile border, or 3,000-mile border in the case of Canada, a 3,000-mile border with the United States, you know, it's like sleeping with an elephant. The elephant turns over and you get crushed. He said, it's really difficult to have that border with the United States. And the Japanese diplomats looked at him and said, we wish we had your problem. And it's the same thing for Mexico. Of course, living next door to the superpower, the one remaining superpower in the world, is not ideal. It's difficult, but the opportunities are enormous. The world's largest national market is right there. And having a free trade agreement with the United States in and of itself is just such a privileged position. Mexico right now should be doing everything it can to attract investment back from China to Mexico. We should be seeing factories opening everywhere across the north of Mexico and in central Mexico. We should see record FDI levels coming into Mexico, as well as record domestic investment taking place. But we're not seeing that. In fact, it seems as though AMLO is doing everything he can to repel investment, to push it away from Mexico. All of the examples that I gave you in at the beginning of this presentation, whether it is the airport, the cerveceria, the brewery, or whether it is his obsession with building a refinery, all of these are ways in which AMLO is pushing investors away. And AMLO doesn't see it. AMLO says, well, look, the peso is still strong and the peso is stable. We're obviously in a good place. Well, no, we're not. We're in a bad place. We are in a place where we should be supremely thankful that USMCA exists, because without that, I fear that Mexico would be in dire, dire economic straits. Will North American cooperation return? Well, I do hope so. I think that we are likely to see an effort in the first year of the Biden administration to bring together the three North American leaders. With the transition from NAFTA to USMCA, we see that there is now a healthy economic relationship. But of course, the USMCA is about more than just trade and investment. We've seen the creation, for example, of a North American Competitiveness Council. We've got chapters, a chapter in the USMCA on fighting corruption together. And as I said earlier on, Joe Biden is somebody who believes in the need for institutions. And certainly the folks on the Biden team believe very firmly that the way to fight China is by the North American nations coming together. The North American nations complement each other. And the regional manufacturing platform that exists in North America is really the best and most competitive in the world. So I suspect that as we go into 2021, we know that we have a scheduled meeting of the Summit of the Americas that will take place in the United States. It's supposed to take place in the spring. It'll probably be pushed to the fall of the year. But at that point in time, we will see Trudeau, Biden, and hopefully López Obrador coming together in a side meeting, and they will announce that in 2022, there will be a North American Leaders Summit, the NALS. The last one that took place was in 2016. As soon as Donald Trump came into office, they stopped. Biden wants to return to that institutional approach. AMLO is not an institutionalist. He will resist it. But if Trudeau agrees to come to the United States for a summit, then it'll be very difficult for AMLO to say no. That would send exactly the wrong message to the United States and Canada and to global investors. So I'm hopeful that we will see a return to the institutional approach of the North American Leaders Summit, the NALS. And I think that that may open up possibilities, because by then we're going to be looking at what happens after AMLO. And lastly, an issue which I know is very, very, very important to many of you on this in this event: the reopening of the border. Let me just say a little bit about the closing of the border due to COVID. Although it was terribly sad that families have not been able to maintain the same frequency of visits across the border as they had beforehand, although it's less than ideal that we have cut that kind of intercourse, and although we know that there is an economic cost of this, shopping, cross-border shopping being just one, but also think about the restrictions that are placed on human capital, people who need to go back and forth across the border for work. But I have to say that the implementation of the border restrictions was enormously successful. And it was successful for one real reason, which is that it was done in a coordinated, collaborative fashion. In other words, the two governments, the US and Mexico, and of course on the other side, the US and Canada, worked together to make sure that the disruptions were minimal. This was not a classic story of the Trump administration where a unilateral decision was taken and the United States imposed its will on others. In fact, what we saw was something very, very different. We saw that the United States sat down with Canada and with Mexico and negotiated. And I think they used input from the private sector and from civil society to do this in a way which reduced or mitigated the harm of border closures. So in that sense, it has been successful. And now we're moving into the vaccination phase for the COVID pandemic. I think that there is a belief that there is light at the end of the tunnel for these border restrictions. In conversations that I've had very recently with Customs and Border Protection here in Washington and with Homeland Security, they know that pressure is going to increase as we move into the spring of 2021 to get rid of those border restrictions. And so what kind of protocols are we going to see in place? Well, first of all, look at the experience of what we had after 9/11. We saw a move towards a smart border. We saw a move towards global entry, nexus, sentry in North America. In other words, pre-clearance for human beings, trusted travelers, pre-clearance for goods as well. We saw an approach to the post 9/11 world where we saw that borders could be both more secure and more efficient. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 20 years or 19 years. The post-COVID solution will be very similar. We're going to be requiring more information, more data from travelers and from shippers. There will be something like a health passport that travelers will have to take with them when they cross the border to show that they have had the vaccinations that they need to have. And the reason that this is going to be the case is obviously because the COVID pandemic is not the last pandemic. There are going to be other pandemics. I do hope that the North American plan for animal and pandemic influenza, which was negotiated back in 2008, 2009, and has been updated, I do hope that that is updated after COVID, because that should lay out a pathway for how we deal with travel within North America, and in particular across borders. And a lot of people say, well, listen, isn't this going to be incredibly expensive and restrictive? Well, some of you who are at this event may remember the old days when, in order to cross over the US-Mexico border, you had to carry with you your vaccination card. That's where we're going back to, but it will be a 21st century version of that. The border will become more intelligent. And I have to say that, and in this, to try to end on an optimistic note, I do believe that the Biden administration coming in to office on the 20th of January next year will be an administration which believes firmly in consultation with the private sector, consultation with experts, consultation with science. They will make their policy decisions based upon the best intelligence. And that's good news for the border. It's good news for border states. And it's particularly good news for Chihuahua, because when those restrictions are removed, I think we will see both a more secure US-Mexico border and we'll see a more efficient US-Mexico border. Many, many thanks for listening to me. I would be delighted to take questions now in English or in Spanish. And please, let's open up the floor for discussion.
Así es, al contrario, Duncan, estamos muy agradecidos contigo por esta interesante conferencia que nos habla acerca del futuro de la relación bilateral México-Estados Unidos post-2020. Estamos viendo que ya tenemos algunas preguntas. Duncan, tú, no sé si le gustas dar lectura.
Sí. Okay, how can Chihuahua and the border region take full advantage of the opportunity of the US-China trade war? So let's take this as a the answer should be based upon what Chihuahua can do, because let's face it, there's very little that we can do about what's happening in Mexico City, at least for now. I mean, the one thing that I would say on that is just make sure you vote in the midterm elections next year. That is vitally important, because it's in elections that we have the opportunity to change policy. But at the state level, number one, I would say this: focus on human capital. Human capital continues to be the #1 most important factor for companies investing. They need to have a workforce which is well educated enough so that those investors can continue to do training. So creating the educational opportunities, making sure that it's not just education isn't just something that ends when you get to 18 or when you graduate from university, but we have to have a focus on lifelong learning. And the way to do this, I believe, is actually to think about this in a cross-border way. Chihuahua should be working with Texas, with New Mexico, in terms of expanding educational opportunities for Chihuahuenses. I think the most important thing that can be done here is to try to get more people from Chihuahua taking courses in person or online at US institutions, and getting more US institutions to come across the border to do that. Interestingly, we have, of course, the announcement today that the new ambassador to Washington will be Esteban Moctezuma, the education secretary. I wonder if we will see an attempt to bring back a bilateral agenda on educational cooperation that we saw during the Obama administration years, and where the Peña Nieto government and the Obama administration worked very closely to come up with new mechanisms for encouraging exchange agreements between US and Mexican universities, and to create a strategy for internships that were crossing the border. That's something where I think that Chihuahua could make a great deal of a difference. Secondly, I believe firmly that infrastructure matters. It's not enough that we have a 21st century border. We have to have 21st century infrastructure getting to the border. So there needs to be pressure from Chihuahua, and again, working with its counterparts in Texas and New Mexico, pressure on federal authorities to improve, yes, the border infrastructure itself, make sure there are enough lanes, make sure there are new protocols to speed cross-border traffic, and to make sure that roads are built in Chihuahua that can get goods to the border as quickly as possible. And when I say roads, I don't just mean tarmac. I mean also we need to think about increasing the infrastructure available for railroads. Railroads are really such an important 21st century infrastructure component, and we haven't invested enough in them. So education, infrastructure, but then the third one is perhaps the most difficult, and that is the question of public security. We need to see a new era of cooperation between the private sector, civil society, and government to try to control the pandemic of insecurity that exists in Mexico, in particular in Chihuahua. And a lot of the work that we've done at Wilson Center over the years has focused on this. And there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that you can do that will end it, but there's lots of ways that are more about approaches to it. And one thing is that you need to have that kind of collaboration between the private sector, civil society, and government. You need to make sure that you make information as widely available as possible. You need to make sure that you have the cooperation of communities. And you need to make sure that you invest in the poorer segments of society. None of those things on their own are going to solve the problem. Even together, you're still going to have a problem with violence and drug trafficking, probably for a decade more at least. But you can mitigate, you can reduce, and that's something that will reduce the costs of that pandemic of insecurity. And so, you know, I would urge you to look at some of the work that we've done at the Wilson Center, in particular a publication called Resilient Communities. That's something that I think has many lessons about what can be effectively be done. And of course, Chihuahua has the experience of the mesas de seguridad. We need to invest with renewed vigor in that idea to bring together people who can really make a difference. And then just one last thing that I would say, which is that even if there is a government in Mexico City that isn't interested in cross-border collaboration, that isn't interested in North America, we know that the states are. We know that the state of Chihuahua, the state of Nuevo León, the state of Tamaulipas, the state of Coahuila, the state of Sonora, and the state of Baja California, they care about it. We know that the states of Querétaro and Guanajuato care about it. And we know that the states across the border in the United States care about this as well. From Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, if you pull together the border states of Mexico and the United States, you look at their combined GDP, and we have one of the top 5 economies in the world. That's an extraordinary thing. That's a very privileged place to be. And of course, all of that prosperity depends upon having a functioning border and having cross-border traffic. So working at the level of the governors, I think, is a very important thing. And I would love to see a governor of Chihuahua coming forward and speaking to their counterparts in Mexico and across the border in the United States and saying, we need to have a border governors conference again. They used to exist, and then it fell apart when Arizona decided to implement anti-migrant laws. It's time to bring them back, because what we've learned from the past 4 years here in the United States is you cannot depend on the federal government. What we're learning in Mexico right now is you cannot depend on the federal government. So let's bring this down, this cooperation, let's bring it down to a level where people care, where people have an interest in it. That's one of the most important things that we could do at this point in time. Thank you. What are the risks of AMLO repealing the energy reform of 2013? You know, I've been working on the energy reform or energy politics in Mexico since 2005. I remember the abortive attempts in 2008 to reform and open up the system. Ultimately, they didn't go very far. But the 2013 reform was remarkable in so many ways. One, because in the end, it was a complete opening of all levels of the value chain for hydrocarbons and electricity. In other words, Mexico went from being one of the most closed countries in the world to being one of the most open countries when it came to foreign and private investment in the energy sector. That was a paradigm shift. And I think that we have seen many benefits from that. It hasn't been completely successful, I will confess. We know that Pemex continues to be rotten from the inside out. We know that Pemex continues to be inefficient. What we need to see now, I think, is a focus on the energy sector whereby Pemex is cleaned up and made more efficient. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening. What we're seeing from AMLO is an obsession with making Pemex into a monopoly again in the energy space. And he speaks now quite openly about his desire to repeal the reform of 2013. And I do suspect that if he wins his qualified majority in the Mexican Congress, in the Cámara de Diputados in 2021, then he will make an attempt to get rid of the energy reform of 2013. Now, all of those oil companies that already hold contracts, they will be allowed to keep those contracts, because the last thing that he wants is an all-out war with the United States under the terms of USMCA. And so he won't risk that. He will allow them to grandfather their contracts in. But we will see a constitutional reform that will change the structure of the energy sector once again, and sadly for the worse. And the reason why I say sadly is because Mexico has this opportunity. It's had it since 2013 and the passing of the constitutional reform in December of 2013. It has an opportunity to maximize the benefits from its natural endowments. That is, the oil that exists on shore and in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Because of the suspension of the bidding rounds since 2018, we have not seen new money coming in. We've not seen very many new projects, none from the private sector, some from Pemex. And the 160 billion barrels of oil that may be underneath the Gulf of Mexico, that oil, ultimately, lots of it will just stay under the Gulf of Mexico. Because, as we all know, it takes a long time to get an oil project going. If you're operating in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it may be as much as 10 years from the auction, the oil auction, through to first oil production. And because of that, unless we were to see new bidding rounds take place in 2021, which we're not going to see, we will not see any new oil being produced by private money before 2031. And by 2031, we're moving rapidly into a world where we're past peak demand for oil and where we see private companies like British Petroleum, Shell, and most recently ExxonMobil moving away from their image and their profile as an oil company to being energy companies. They're focusing on questions of carbon capture. They're focusing on questions of carbon credits. These are companies that see the writing on the wall, but AMLO believes that Pemex is the future. Pemex is not the future. Pemex is the past, unfortunately. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of respect for Pemex. Pemex has done some great things over the years, and there's a lot of very, very smart people who work in Pemex. But the leadership of Pemex for many years now has been lamentable. And the sad thing is that we desperately need to see more and more focus on the energy sector. Now, we've talked about oil and gas, but what about electricity? Well, what we're seeing right now is that the current administration seems to have no interest in investing in renewable energy, which is a tremendous shame. AMLO talks a lot about energy sovereignty, and, you know, that's fine. It's essentially energy nationalism. We've heard this many times over the years from many different people. But if you're really an energy nationalist, you should be totally in love with solar and wind, because that gives you complete independence. But AMLO doesn't see it that way. So I have to say that I'm very pessimistic at the moment. And once again, we come down to the importance of the election in 2021, because if AMLO wins that qualified majority in the Chamber of Deputies again, then he will go ahead and push for an energy counter reform. Well, this is sort of the doomsday scenario that I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, I think. We know that things have been getting worse in Mexico for the last 13 years, despite the intense cooperation, trust building that has taken place between the United States. Right now, we are in a very delicate and pivotal moment in the security relationship. The Cienfuegos case, the new legislation over DEA agents, and the declaration recently from Relaciones Exteriores that the Merida initiative is over. All of that says to me that Mexico does not want to continue with security cooperation. And one thing that I will say here, which is very, very important, I think, is that it's always been Mexico who determines how much cooperation there is. Speaking to folks here in the US government who have worked closely with Mexico, they always say, look, unless we get Mexican cooperation, there's not a lot we can actually do in Mexico. And of course, if they were to take away immunity for our agents down in Mexico, then there's very little we can do. At least there's very little they can do through the traditional established institutional mechanisms. I fear that if AMLO decides to shut off cooperation with the United States on public security and the fight against organized crime, the United States might just do it anyway. The United States will do it behind the scenes without notifying Mexican counterparts. And there will be US government agents operating south of the border in violation of Mexican law. And that is a very risky scenario, because imagine that we get another incident like the Kiki Camarena case, or perhaps a DEA agent who is arrested by Mexican authorities. Does AMLO then choose to prosecute that person, put them in jail, and risk a complete diplomatic breakdown with the United States? No. My colleague at the Wilson Center, former Ambassador Tony Wayne, talks a lot about this. He says, look, that law that was passed yesterday didn't have to be so specific. It could have made some general statements about the need for respect, and that Mexico is a sovereign country, and that the United States needs to consult with Mexico on everything. It didn't need to get so specific about taking away immunity from DEA agents. Because if that was the case, it would have given AMLO the freedom to decide when and how to react. But the fact is, they did pass that law. And so now we're in this very difficult situation where DEA agents will not feel as though they are protected. And I could see that security cooperation breaking down. And that leads us to the doomsday scenario, which is that without effective intelligence being shared by the United States with their Mexican counterparts, because in order to do that, you need to have trust. And that trust is rapidly evaporating. Without that intelligence sharing, the Mexican authorities are going to be severely handicapped. It's not a question of guns and tanks and helicopters. It's a question of, do you know where and how organized crime is operating? And without intelligence sharing from the United States, then Mexico will not have that information. And that, I think, is where there is a huge cost, or huge potential cost, for the Mexican public, which is that I fear that we could see even higher levels of violence, greater levels of corruption than we've seen already. I hope that AMLO comes to his senses. I hope that AMLO doesn't sign that law. I don't know whether he did today. I haven't seen that yet. But I hope he doesn't, because there's still time to get out of this. And I believe that his belief right now is that because we're in a transition here in the United States, he can get away with these things. He can't. Everybody here in the United States who knows anything about this issue is up in arms about it. And they recognize how damaging it is. As I said earlier on, there are a lot of people here in the security and intelligence communities who say, Mexico screwed us. They told us that they would not do this if we returned Cienfuegos, then they went ahead and did it anyway. So that does not augur well for the next phase of cooperation between a Biden administration and AMLO administration. But as I said, it's not too late. What we will see in 2021, I believe, is a renewed attempt by the US Congress to try to come up with a new, reinvigorated Merida initiative. It will be called something else, but it will focus on a modernization of security cooperation between Mexico and the United States. That is the true opportunity here, that we could actually learn from what has worked and what has not worked. We have a very interesting podcast, which is out right now from the Wilson Center. It's called America's 360. And in the latest episode, we interviewed Dan Restrepo, a former National Security Council advisor on Western Hemisphere to the Obama administration, and one of the folks who has been advising Joe Biden. And he said the same thing. He said, there's an opportunity here, but more important than that, this is too important an issue to let it just deteriorate. We have to send that message to Mexico that this matters to the United States. Thank you. Do I think the Biden's arrival to the U.S. government is a break to AMLO's public policies? Yeah. It's a challenge. It's not a break so much. Listen, Biden's capacity to interfere in Mexican internal politics and policy is limited. He can do so through the legal mechanisms that are established in the USMCA. He can do so through diplomatic pressure. I think that, we'll see on migration, for example, there will be intense diplomatic pressure beginning on the 21st of January for Mexico to continue stopping Central Americans from moving through the country. And of course, we will see a renewed focus on climate change, which will apply pressure to AMLO. In terms of democratic institutional erosion in the country, which I worry about the attacks on the INE. I worry about the attacks on the Banco de Mexico. And thank God, by the way, that legislation did not get approved yet in Mexico over the Banco de Mexico buying dollar deposits. That's a very, very important thing, which raised a lot of concerns here in Washington. But beyond those things, I think that what we see is that the United States cannot really influence what's happening in internal politics, and AMLO knows that. AMLO knows that he has freedom from that, but I think that that's always been the case. A lot of people got very excited that Donald Trump was the way to control AMLO. Donald Trump controlled AMLO for things that mattered to Donald Trump. But Donald Trump doesn't care about internal politics in Mexico. He doesn't care about democracy in Mexico. He doesn't care about the federal system in Mexico. I do think that what we're going to see is a challenge for AMLO, is that he's going to move from this kind of one-dimensional relationship with the United States, which is all about migration, to being a multi-dimensional approach, where the Biden people are going to be pushing him on migration, on security, on trade, investment, climate change, corruption, etc. It's going to be a very different relationship, and it's going to be one which will stretch his capacity to manage it. AMLO has managed Trump expertly, but it's going to be very different, and I think he's got a lot to learn about Biden and about how the US government works. In many ways, AMLO was fortunate to come in with Trump as US president. But now he's going to see what the United States is truly capable of. And the United States is, if nothing, or the United States government, if nothing else, is a huge monster with many, many heads. And he and his government are going to feel the pressure on many different fronts. So that's where I think, particularly in the era of Republican austerity in Mexico, AMLO is going to find himself seriously challenged, because it's going to be non-stop. And we still have to see who the next U.S. ambassador to Mexico is going to be. Ambassador Landau, in my opinion, has done a fabulous job in his time in Mexico. But Landau is not a professional diplomat, and as he himself has recognized, as people at the embassy have recognized, the three most important issues in the bilateral relationship for Trump are migration, migration, migration. It's going to be very different. We're going to see pressure on all fronts from Biden, and I suspect that we will get a very highly qualified and very experienced ambassador going in there who will be able to operate that relationship extremely well for the Biden administration. Thank you. All right. So which promotion strategy do you suggest we follow to have better results at the state of Chihuahua? I talked earlier on about education, human capital, infrastructure, public security. One thing that I didn't talk about was actually the issue that AMLO talks about most of the time, and that is corruption and transparency. I think we can depend on the Mexican federal government to take this struggle against corruption seriously. But state governments can do a great deal. State governments can implement laws. State governments can put in place protocols. State governments can hand out contracts for infrastructure that are transparent and clean. We need to demand a higher level of integrity from our politicians And I'm talking about from local mayors, the presidentes municipales, up to the governor, from state legislators, from funcionarios who are engaged in government contracting, but we also need to do it for the private sector. And allow me just to put on my hat for a moment of co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on anti-corruption and transparency. What we work on there is approaches from the private sector to increase transparency and to fight corruption. The mechanisms that private companies can take to make sure that they are guided by policies of integrity. And it's not rocket science. It's not difficult to think of what you can do to reduce corruption within your own company. There's lots of things that you can do. The very simplest thing is to make sure that on every major project, you have a financial integrity auditor. In other words, one person or a team of people who are overseeing the entire project from the point of view of business integrity, to make sure that contracts are transparent, to make sure that best practices are being followed, to make sure that nobody is colluding with government officials. Private companies need to do that more because, as we all know, corruption is like tango or salsa. It takes two to do it well. If you take out the private sector, governments will not be able to do it well. Because what I've learned in my life is that we cannot depend upon public officials. There are many public officials who have integrity, but there are many who don't. And we can't control that. What we can control is within our own organizations that the proper procedures and protocols are taken, that we have the right kind of gatekeepers in place. And this leads me to the role that finance should play. The banks who finance investment in Mexico need to insist that principles of integrity are applied to all of these projects. Because if we can do that, then we can reduce the scope for corruption. And I think that this is one of the areas where we see the importance of legislation that is on the books here in the United States. And I'm talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, which has come to light again recently in the Vitol case in Mexico. This was not an investigation that was carried out by Mexican authorities. It was an investigation that was carried out by US authorities. It's the same thing with the Odebrecht scandal. It's the same thing with the Walmart corruption case back in 2010 or wherever it was. What happened was that foreign authorities did the investigation. They turned up the evidence and they prosecuted it. But Mexican authorities never do that. In other words, what we need to do is we need to make sure we abide not by the best practices or the standards that exist in Mexico. We need to look at the best practices and the standards around the world. Who should be your allies in the United States? The attorneys general of the United States, of the states of the United States. Those are people who know a lot about this, and there is a willingness to engage with their counterparts across the border. And once again, I would say this idea of bringing back the Border Governors Conference and bringing back an annual meeting of the attorneys general of the border states, that is something which has real potential for moving an agenda forward, for bringing forward business integrity in the state of Chihuahua. Thanks. What do you think would have happened if Trump was reelected? It's a really good question. I lost a lot of sleep over that one. So the simple answer is we would have seen more of the same, right? There would have been continuity, but that's not a very interesting answer. So I think that what we would have seen would have been that Trump would have been emboldened. He would have felt empowered to do more of what he was doing. I think we would have seen that the pressure on Mexico to control migration would have continued. Yes, absolutely. But there would have been renewed pressure on the fight against organized crime and the flow of drugs. And I think that that's something that that AMLO didn't think about. And certainly we would have seen a much more aggressive Trump in terms of building the border wall. I think that it wouldn't have been a bad thing for the economic relationship, because the one thing that Trump did well, with the exception of 2020, was economic management. He took away a lot of regulations, and the US economy and the US stock market reacted incredibly positively. Whether or not that would have continued after COVID is another question. We all know that there were severe costs on that. But I think that, we would have been in for another 4 years of sort of business as usual. And I think that AMLO would have been very, very happy with that. There would have been extra pressure on organized crime and drug trafficking. That's always been an issue that has mattered to the Republicans. But perhaps the most frightening thing is what we would have seen here in the United States, which is, as we've seen since the election, there has been an erosion of the consensus on democracy and elections. Because we have survived that, we have an opportunity here to reevaluate, to go back to basics, and to begin to say we need to strengthen the institutions that exist here in the United States that promote and defend democracy. And I think that's a good thing long-term for the United States, obviously. But I think it's also a very, very important thing in terms of the message it sends down to Mexico City, which is that democracy matters. You cannot weaken the institutions of democracy without paying a very high cost. Thanks.